In this video, we are going to look at some examples of the C# coding standards and look at naming conventions, best practices, and some of the things that you can start to use in your own projects and kind of adjust these to your own needs. So the first thing I want to point out is the use of Pascal casing. So in this example method, calculate total, Pascal casing dictates that we capitalize the first letter of the word and then the first letter of every word after that. Pascal casing is good for class names and method names and is consistent with the .NET Framework standards, and it generally makes things easy to read. You can also use what we call camel casing for method arguments and local variables. Camel casing does not capitalize the first letter of the first word, but does capitalize the first letter of every word after that. Again, this is consistent with the .NET Framework standards and makes things easy to read. We want to avoid a couple of naming standards, primarily what we call Hungarian notation, which is where we add a small abbreviation or a letter in front of a variable name that indicates its data type. This is an old habit developed from programming languages that did not have such easy typing or such easy tools that would be able to tell you what data type a variable was. So while declaring something int counter is correct, int I counter using the Hungarian notation generally is frowned upon. So this is consistent with Microsoft's .NET Framework standards. And since the Visual Studio software makes determining these types very easy via tooltips, we can put our mouse over it and we can see what data type it is when we're using it. We generally want to avoid these types of indicators in our variable names. We also want to avoid using what are called screaming caps or putting constant variables or read-only variables all in caps. Caps grab too much attention and they make it hard to read. And since Visual Studio is very clear on being able to tell us, if it's a constant or read-only variable, the old convention was to put these all in caps so we would know, but since Visual Studio now does that work for us, it doesn't seem logical to continue. Another naming convention that I would like to draw your attention to is the use of abbreviations. So in order to be consistent with the .NET Framework standards, which prevents inconsistent abbreviations, we don't want to abbreviate anything except commonly used names. So it would be correct to create a variable named user group, but we would not want to abbreviate user group into a variable that's ultimately hard to read. Since Visual Studio makes it very easy for us to see variables in the IntelliSense as you're typing and tab them so you don't have to type them all out, using names that are much more descriptive as to the data held inside and that are much more readable is the preferred convention. Now, it is acceptable for abbreviations that are common, such as FTP, URI, and XML, to be parts of variable names. We just want to watch out that we aren't abbreviating things that most people would not understand or are not easily readable. Furthermore, I would discourage you from using underscores in your variable names. These generally make the code harder to read. It's much more natural to read without the underscore, and it generally makes the variable name not only easier to read, but shorter. Underscores also create the problem where you are unable to see the underline unless you have the font size turned up quite a bit. So for programmers that like to use just a regular text size, it can be troublesome to use an underscore. Now, the only exception to this is when we have a private variable. It is generally accepted convention to prefix private variables with an underscore. And so this is really the only exception to saying don't use underscores in your variables. So in the next video, we'll look at some more examples of using C# coding conventions.